Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where every day I look at how technology is transforming our life, business, industry, and indeed world. Now, as the global pandemic spreads across the world, for most of us and our families, we've never seen anything on this scale before. And it has completely changed how we live and how we work. But as an optimist, I always try to learn from the experience of others and find new ways forward. So when I learned of a story about an Emmy award-winning journalist and former war correspondent who has shifted to starting his own tech company called Trint, which is an AI-based transcription company, and also thinks that artificial intelligence could help solve the problem of disinformation, it instantly resonated with me. And I hope it will with you too. Because today I want to explore the fact that at the moment, many of us are seeing firsthand the best and worst side of humanity. And much of that, of course, is because people are trying to make sense of what is happening around them. So I wanted Jeff to share what he has learned from his time as a war correspondent and travelling the world. And maybe we can all continue to learn from the experience of others and also learn how we can create our own tech-based solutions and use this crisis as a catalyst for innovation. So, I invite you to let me beam your ears all the way to London so we can speak with Jeff Kofman, the Emmy-winning foreign and war correspondent with ABC News, CBS News and CBC News, who's going to share his experiences and talk about how it helped him shape the vision and later on launch Trint. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
I kind of joke that I'm the accidental entrepreneur. I am originally from Toronto, lived in the US for a long time and worked all over the world as a broadcast journalist at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and then spent more than 30 years on television as a reporter, foreign correspondent, war correspondent with CBS Evening News in New York and ABC News based in Miami, covering the southern US, Latin America. And during the Iraq War, commuting from 2003 to 5 to Baghdad, moved here to London, England at the end of 2010 with ABC News as London correspondent. Did that till November 30th, 2014, when I left, and the next day became a tech innovator and entrepreneur and business guy, something that I just did not see coming. If you had told me 10 years ago, I would have said, there's no way I'm leaving journalism. I love what I do. It's my passion. It excites me. I would have bet you huge amounts of money and you would have won because I surprised myself. Here I am.
So I've got to ask there, as an Emmy award-winning journalist, what put you on this path that you're on right now?
You know, I think it's really, I guess one of the good lessons that I've learned is that it's really important to allow yourself to be surprised by your own decisions. I just did not see this coming. I knew that I could feel that it was becoming time, the time was approaching to leave broadcast journalism. I'd done it for more than 30 years. It's really rewarding. I reported from, I don't know how many countries, 40, 50 countries, maybe more. I'd covered a lot of wars. I won my second Emmy, as you note, covering the fall of Muammar Gaddafi during the Arab Spring in 2011. It was unbelievably rewarding. And in terms of the bucket list of life and careers, I ticked every box and many, many more. You know, I reported from the Galapagos, did documentaries on penguins in Patagonia, spent time in Colombia on the drug wars, covered revolutions in Latin America and the Caribbean, saw the best and the worst of humanity, and was challenged in ways that I don't think very many people have the opportunity to be. I guess one of the things that when I look back to answer your question is that you become, I wouldn't say fearless, but not afraid of risk and change. It doesn't mean that as a war correspondent, I wasn't terrified and didn't quake in my boots at times, but it's more, I think that doing those things gives you the perspective on risk And I think I saw an opportunity. I met by accident some developers who'd done some work with audio and text. And I guess it was 2013 when I was still at ABC News. I was teaching an overseas journalism program for an American university. And I just asked the innocent question, why do I have to transcribe my interviews, speeches, and news conferences the way they did in the 1960s in the 21st century when automated speech is so good and almost useful? And that led to the question, well, what do you mean? What would the solution have to look like? And we didn't know each other, but we kind of kept in touch over Skype and did some experiments that worked so well. And I remember saying, I think we've just invented the future. Either we get together and actually build something that does this, or we go our separate ways, never see each other. And one day you're going to walk into a Starbucks and someone will be on the platform that we've just kind of cobbled together. And I felt the time in life was right to take a risk.
And that risk certainly paid off. I mean, you're now the CEO and co-founder at Trint, which for people hearing about it for the first time is an AI-based transcription company. Can you just set the scene for people hearing about it for the first time and just tell them what it is and who it's aimed at and the kind of problems that it solves?
Essentially, the problem that I wanted to solve was this. I hate transcribing interviews and speeches. If you imagine that this conversation you and I are having is a standard reporter's interview, and it's going to go 20, 30 minutes, and I just need 15 seconds here, 10 seconds there. I don't need the whole thing. Traditionally, the way it's been done is you put on your headsets, you rewind to the top, and you hit play, you hit stop, and you type. And you do that until you find the moments that matter, the moments that you're going to use in your story. Quotes, if you're writing a print story, in television, we call them sound bites. Either way, you need the precise words from what your guest has said in order to write the story around it, to write your script or your news story, your magazine article, your academic research. It doesn't matter. That process really goes back to the 1960s when cassette recorders were first introduced. And that's the way most reporters have done it for generations. Prior to that, it was shorthand, but I'm not old enough to learn shorthand, I can tell you. The question I asked is, automated speech is almost useful, but it makes mistakes. I can't handle imperfect data, which means speech to text that is not 100% accurate. I need to trust my transcripts, or I will use a quote that is incorrect. I'll get sued and fired, etc., and I'm not going to put myself in that position. So how do you leverage the output of artificial intelligence, in this case, automated speech to text, to do the heavy lifting and empower the user to do that final push to perfect? And that was the challenge that we set out for ourselves. And the answer was the Trint editor, which is the core innovation of Trint, which takes an audio video player and marries it to text, much like Microsoft Word, and creates this interactive editor. If you think of karaoke, the words follow the audio. So as I speak, the words get dark in front of me. I can search the word and I can find the references to it. I can scan with my eye. I hit play and I can hear it. If there's an error, if there's an exotic name, a technical term, or if I slur or we interrupt each other, I can listen carefully and I can fix it. And so I can find that moment that matters in a matter of 30 seconds or a minute, whereas it might take me half an hour or longer. And so it's really about liberating people from the menial part of their work so they can focus on the meaningful part of their work. It's kind of, transcription is just one of those things you have to do if you're a writer or a researcher, if you do anything with content. And what I wanted to do was to get the tedious out of our lives so we could focus on the interesting stuff. And I think it's really important to understand that in today's world, when I started in Toronto as a local news reporter in the 1980s, I did a TV story and I went home. No journalist and no one in content production does that anymore. It's going to end up in social media. It will end up online. It will end up if you're at ABC News, where I worked, there was ABC News Radio. Then there were the affiliates, the local stations that would take my content as a national reporter, et cetera. And so the content could end up on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, on podcasts. So you've got all these people now coming at that content, and the thing that the bottleneck in content production has been transcription. We need to all have access. At CNN, they told me no one is allowed to distribute content until everyone has access. And that means until there's a transcript, no one can publish it because they don't want one arm of CNN publishing it, some competitor to find it and republish it before another arm of CNN has it. So Trint enables CNN and others to actually get that transcript out. Because we have a collaborative editor, if you think like Google Docs, it means that 30, 50 people can be on that same transcript. If it's a major piece of news, they can all be using it for their own purposes, but they all have a single source of truth, and they can't get burned because they got the audio and the video married to the text on the screen.
And you made a great point a few moments ago about bad data and how, that could just bring everything crashing down. And I've attempted to test a few solutions out there. Otter AI is one example, which plugs into so many things at the moment. But for the most part, it is just too inaccurate. And it would actually take longer to change and amend those mistakes than actually just transcribe it in the first place. So how did you overcome that accuracy problem? Is it the artificial intelligence that comes into play here?
It's, listen, part of this sits with us and part of it sits with the user.
Yeah.
The artificial intelligence is getting smarter and smarter. Computers over the last 20 years have gotten so much faster, and the ability to store huge amounts of data to process that really quickly has become just so impressive in the last 10, 15 years. And that's why you've got products like Alexa and Siri that work really, really, really well. But the key to this is we're as good as what you give us. If you give us bad audio, if you put an iPhone on the table in a coffee shop and have 6 people talking and interrupting each other, and music in the background and a cappuccino machine screeching in the corner, you're not going to get a good transcript from AI from anyone. It just isn't possible. So part of getting this to work is training and informing and enabling users to understand what is good audio. And that was when we first launched in 2016, we used to get quite a lot of people sending in notes saying, hey, your product doesn't work. I want my money back. We would say, listen, we won't listen to you. We can't listen to your recording, but if you want to share it with us, we'd love to feedback. And what we found was that invariably when they said Trint didn't work, it was because the audio was really bad. I remember one very funny, very insulting note written by a student who said, you guys should, must be on drugs if you think this works. And it was, anyway, he shared his audio, and he had recorded what was a university lecture with his mobile phone on the desk in a very echoey hall, and the speakers were very far away. I swear to you, I could not have transcribed that lecture manually with headphones if the audio was so bad. And he had the assumption that we would be able to get it perfect because he could hear it perfect. When we explained what was going on, we said, try it again, but make sure you've got a good audio feed. Things changed. And so really it is about explaining to people that interruption, distant microphones, very soft voices, very, very heavy accents, all of those things will degrade the quality. But if you give us good quality, the returns can be north of 95, 98%. If you take someone like Donald Trump or Barack Obama, to be completely nonpartisan here, both of them come out north of 99%. They both speak clearly, slowly, and they both speak clearly and slowly, and they both use very, very simple language. And so it's really, really interesting. But the problem about around bad audio that we used to hear, we just don't get complaints about it anymore.
And I'm curious, how has your background as a journalist actually prepared you for what you're doing now with Trint? There's got to be a few things that have come in handy.
I'm not kidding you. When I began this company, I used to stand up in front of investors and say something that was probably pretty ill-advised, but I thought it was honest. And I used to say, listen, I am the most unqualified person in this room to be running a tech startup. But I had a good idea, and people seem to think it's a really good idea. And I think people kind of liked my honesty. I think that there are a bunch of things that being a journalist helps me with, and there are a bunch of skills that I've lacked that have been made it a really hard journey. I think a couple of the things that are useful for me. One is it turns out I fit into a profile of a classic late stage entrepreneur. I am solving a problem that I've lived intimately. The team used to call me beta tester number one because I know that from the very beginning, I knew that it had to work for me to work for anyone. And so I understood that there was a basic level of functionality. If I wasn't going to use it, I couldn't really call up you and say, hey, we've invented this amazing thing. It doesn't work for me, but maybe it'll work for you. I wasn't changing the taxi industry, the food delivery industry, two industries I know nothing about. I was changing content production for journalists. And so that's what I've lived for 30 years. I would dare say that I've transcribed as many interviews as any reporter around. So I knew what the solution looked like. There are a couple of other things that journalists, it turns out, have that are very helpful. One is I am shameless about admitting what I don't know. I never bluff. And so, I sit next to our finance director. I have no finance background, no business background, and I am totally comfortable at saying to him, tell me again, what is EBITDA? How do I explain it to people? I am not good at this stuff. And it's, I wish I'd taken a finance course. I just didn't have time. So I just hired people who knew what I didn't know and who are incredibly patient at helping me explain and understand. So I think admitting what you don't know is a good quality in life in general. And I think for a startup founder, it's really helpful. Journalists, it turns out, are really entrepreneurial. When I worked at ABC News and covered Latin America, I used to put together proposed stories, and we'd have to have budgets, and we'd have to sell them to Good Morning America, ABC World News, Nightline, ABC Radio, and raise budgets for these extremely expensive trips that we would have to then deliver on. And these kind of trips were driven by me and my producer. And so, you have to hustle, and to be a good reporter, you've got to be an entrepreneur. You've got to be competitive. It turns out those qualities really matter for an entrepreneur. You need to know your limits. I think as a war correspondent, it's something that I learned, understanding what you know how to do and what you don't know how to do, when to ask for help. I'm not afraid of failure. I think that for me, my definition of failure is not trying. I think if you worry about what other people think, if you try to do something audacious and it doesn't work, you will never take a risk in life, and you will never get the reward of having risked something. So, I think those are some of the qualities in journalism that keep journalists going and motivate you through a really exciting career. And turns out they're pretty useful. I do wish I had some business background. I'm at this stage with Trint with 55 employees. I've got lots of experienced people, but boy, in the early days, for the first 2.5 years, it's amazing that I was able to keep it going, because I did all of the finance with our accountants and bookkeeper, but I did all of the business side of it on my own. And it was really, really hard for me because I had never done anything like that.
It's a great point you mentioned there about those entrepreneurial qualities within journalism. But I'm curious, from the conversations you've been having, do journalists fear that AI might one day take away their jobs? Or do you think that most of them just see it as an opportunity to enhance and speed up that creative process?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. I think that journalism can be liberated by AI.
Yeah.
What we've seen consistently across journalism is that fewer people in newsrooms are being asked to do more content production on more platforms now. And that pressure is just relentless. It's overwhelming. And so any tool that allows people to actually focus on the content production, not on the technical process of transcription, is seen as liberating. I don't think we're displacing any jobs. And to be clear, Trint is used much more broadly than in journalism. We're used by banks, we're used in marketing, we're used in academic research, we are used in user experience research by companies like Google. We're used really broadly. Corporate production, video production, corporate content production. There isn't a company now in the Western world that doesn't do some sort of online and internal content production, whether it's an internal website, an external website, whether it's videos on their website or through email marketing. Everyone is doing this. So journalism remains our original vertical for sales, but we have grown really fast in these other areas.
And just stepping aside from Trint just for a moment, at the very beginning of our conversation, you said that during your time as a war correspondent, obviously you've seen the best and worst sides of humanity. And for many people at the moment, they're experiencing this for the very first time. It can feel daunting and overwhelming. From your experience, what did you take away from that, and how is it helping you deal with the period of uncertainty that everybody's in at the moment?
It's an interesting question. I think for a lot of people, this is the first time that they have on a day-to-day, in a day-to-day way, been out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
For me, I don't find it unsettling. I find myself focused on dealing with the reality. I find the health issues unsettling, to be clear. Yeah. I think the unknown menace of COVID is really unsettling for all of us. And I've had the symptoms. My doctor believes I've got it, although in the UK, of course, I can't get tested. And that's not been pleasant. It's not been fun. And it is at times a little scary. But I think that my focus is really on dealing with it at home with my family, and dealing with it with my team, and making sure, number one, that the team and the company are healthy, and that we're supporting them in every way, emotionally and technologically, that we can, and that we are as much as possible able to keep life going on a day-to-day basis. And so it requires a lot of imagination, for us. We now have an afternoon coffee break at 3:15 London, 10:15 in Toronto, where we have a sales office for North America. People can just drop in and out. We're doing a virtual yoga session with our team. We do yoga in the office. We decided we would keep our yoga teacher employed. She's out of work, and we thought it wasn't really fair just to cast her aside and use some virtual yoga from off YouTube. So we're doing a virtual yoga session with our live yoga teacher this afternoon, and people will be able to do it from their homes on mats and tune in on Zoom and take part. So it requires a kind of imagination and resilience, and I think it's really important to keep things in perspective. There's no question this is not fun. It's not a period that any of us wishes we were living through. But I think that in order to adapt it, it's about focusing on what's good about life, what's good about our family and our friends and our community, understanding that ultimately, as disruptive as this is and as inconvenient as it is, it's really important to constantly keep in perspective what ultimately matters. And hopefully we'll be able to look back on this in a few months and say, it wasn't fun. I wouldn't want to do it again. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But I actually learned a few things about myself, and it gave me some perspective, because I think that, none of us has been shopping for consumer goods now for a number of weeks. And as much as I understand how horrible that is for the companies and the stores that sell that, we've kind of lost perspective on some of those things. And maybe it will just make us stop and think, did we really need to go out and buy new this and new that? Is that really where our efforts need to go, or should we be putting them into something more substantial?
I completely agree. So many great points in there. And on the other side of all this, of course, what excites you about the future of journalism and the role that Trint will play in them?
I explain it this way. I grew up in the 20th century, reading newspapers on paper, writing postcards when I traveled, writing my university essays, typing them on paper. I was around when the first word processors came out, as we called them, and wrote my first essays in my university in Canada on a DOS computer when I was studying political science. But it was all about text. And I like to, even though television and radio were obviously very dominant in the last half of the 20th century, we were a text-driven economy. We're not anymore. More than 80% of the content on the internet is spoken word, whether it's audio or video. And we are now communicating like this on a podcast, through voice messages, through videos on YouTube or on Facebook or other social media. This is the century of the voice economy. And the voice economy needs tools to allow for content to be easily searched, produced, archived, shared, collaborated on. And that's where Trint fits in. It sounds audacious, but I really believe that we have invented a new language for content production in the 21st century. And that's about making it easy to navigate audio or video, but the spoken word, as it is to navigate text on the screen. And that's really our goal. When I remember the first time word processors, as we used to call them, came out in the early 80s, it just made me want to cry, because I was a writer even at university, and I remember, I was terrible at typing on paper. It was a linear process. You made one mistake on an essay, you had to retype the page. I spent more of my time typing essays on paper, retyping the actual words, than thinking about the words on the page. Suddenly, word processors liberated us from that. Microsoft Word, et cetera. Now, that's what we now need to add to audio and video. We need to make them searchable, shareable, archivable, collaborative, so that finding the content. If you say, hey, I spoke to that guy, Jeff, in 2020, I remember he talked about his experience as a war correspondent. Where is that? Oh, well, it's a 30-minute interview. I don't want to listen to that whole thing. Well, you can now Trint it, search the word Libya, you've got it. And suddenly you're liberated to focus on content production. That's what the 21st century needs. And that's really what we're focused on.
And for anyone listening that would like to be liberated and find out more information about Trint and how it can bring value into everything that they're doing and bringing that content to life, can you just point them in the direction of where they can get that information, and equally contact your team if they're left with any questions?
Really, really easy. Trint, by the way, a word I invented for transcription and interview. It's what's called a portmanteau or neologism. And the website, really simple, trint.com, TRINT.com. I wanted to find a word that was one syllable, easy to spell, easy to remember, and that could be verbized, meaning and turned into a noun. Let's Trint it, let's check the Trint. And what's really, really satisfying is that's how our customers talk about it. Let's Trint it, or I Trinted it yesterday, and it took me only 2 minutes. I figured if it works for Google, it can work for Trint.
Absolutely. Well, I've loved chatting with you today, and also loved hearing your story. I mean, going from the Emmy Award-winning journalist to startup founder here is inspiring on its own. But I think if we scratch beneath that, it almost seems that the pain in those experiences during those word processor days and text-driven economy has actually given you the imagination and the resilience to go ahead and achieve the success that you're having with Trint. So I wish you the best of luck with it. I'd love to get you back on here towards the end of the year and see how things are going. But thanks for joining me today, Jeff. I appreciate it.
A real pleasure. Thanks for your time.
What a powerful story. And I think much of it can be attributed to Jeff transcribing thousands of hours of interviews. But I love his experiences of witnessing a number of issues that were plaguing journalists, all converging at once, and how that inspired him to create Trint. Because any journalist out there will know all about the problems around fewer resources, less time, more disinformation, and so much more. But listening to his story there, it seems that Jeff believes that by shortening the time to access information for reporters and the public, and leveraging AI to help people identify relevant parts of manuscripts, the war against disinformation campaigns. But I love the fact that it was spending 3 decades as a reporter, foreign correspondent and war correspondent, manually transcribing thousands of hours of interviews, speeches, lectures and news conferences. It was all those pain points that gave him the imagination, resiliency and tenacity to succeed with Trint. And for those reasons alone, a big, genuine thank you to Jeff for taking the time to come on here and share his story along with what he learned from witnessing the best and worst sides of humanity. And I think it's food for thought for so many of us who are currently outside of our comfort zone. And another point that Jeff was talking about there, not going out and just buying more stuff for the sake of it. Maybe that actually could be a good thing too, if we just reflect a little bit more on our previous habits. But enough of my ramblings, please. I'd love for you to share your thoughts, your insights, your experiences, your expertise, or even just to ask a question or say hello. Whatever it is, my door is open to each and every one of you. Please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. My website, techblogwriter.co.uk. You'll find over 1,200 podcast interviews and ways that you can work with me too. And right at the bottom, you'll find links to my social channels. I'm the easiest guy in the world to find. Other than that, I'll return tomorrow. I've already got another guest lined up for you all, but it's time for me to go and make myself a drink now. So thanks for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.